The night my life changed forever began with a phone call I never wanted to receive. My name is David Miller, a 32-year-old high school history teacher from Ohio. Just 6 weeks ago, I was living a modest life in a rented apartment, grading papers late into the night. Then tragedy struck my grandparents, Walter and Margaret Miller, the people who had truly raised me, were killed in a sudden highway crash caused by a drunk driver. My parents, Charles and Linda, were there at the funeral, along with my younger brother Eric. They played the part of grieving family, but the truth is, they had grown distant from Walter and Margaret years ago. My grandparents had always lived simply. Despite building a successful trucking company and amassing real wealth, they taught me values, honesty, hard work, and humility, lessons my parents never seemed to embrace. 2 weeks after the funeral, we all gathered at the office of Samuel Brooks, my grandparents' attorney, sitting across that polished oak table. The tension was so thick you could almost taste it. My father, Charles, looked impatient, checking his watch. My mother, Linda, adjusted her pearl necklace, and Eric scrolled his phone, clearly bored. None of us were prepared for what Samuel was about to reveal. That day, in a single breath, I went from an ordinary teacher to the sole heir of a $24 million estate, and in that moment, I learned exactly how money can expose the true colors of family. When Samuel Brooks, my grandparents' attorney, cleared his throat and announced that I was the sole heir to Walter and Margaret Miller's $24 million estate, the room went dead silent. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I looked across the table at my parents and my brother, waiting for Samuel to correct himself, but he didn't. He repeated the words slowly, firmly, as though bracing for the storm about to hit. My father, Charles Miller, was the first to react. His face turned red, and he shoved back his chair so hard it nearly toppled. "That's impossible," he barked. "I'm their son, their only son. Of course the estate should pass to me. That's how this works." My mother, Linda, quickly followed. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. "David, you're a school teacher. You wouldn't know the first thing about managing millions. This family has a reputation, a standard to uphold. Your father is the only one with the experience to handle something this large." And then came my brother, Eric. He slammed his hand on the table, as though that might change the words Samuel had just read. "What about me? I'm family too. I've been working on my startup ideas for years. I just need capital. Grandpa and Grandma knew that. They knew I could make something big if I had the chance." Samuel, calm as ever, pushed his glasses up his nose and continued. "Your grandparents were very deliberate with their decision. They made clear in their will that David alone inherits the estate, every dollar, every piece of property, every share of their business. They also requested that I play a video message recorded before they passed. Perhaps their own words will explain their reasoning better than I can." With that, he pressed a button, and the screen on the wall lit up. Suddenly, I saw my grandparents sitting side by side on the familiar sofa in their farmhouse. Walter looked steady and strong, even in his late 70s, and Margaret's eyes held that same warmth that had comforted me all my life. "If you're watching this," my grandfather began, "it means we've left this world, and we wanted to speak directly so there would be no confusion about our wishes." My grandmother leaned forward slightly. "Charles, Linda, Eric, we love you as family, but we cannot ignore the choices you've made. For too long, money has meant more to you than relationships. You've come to us when you needed loans or favors, but rarely when you simply wanted to spend time together. You judged our modest lifestyle, dismissed our values, and treated us as if we were a bank instead of parents or grandparents." Her words cut through the room like a knife. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then Walter's voice rang out again. "David, on the other hand, has lived by the principles we hold dear: hard work, honesty, compassion. He never once asked us for money. He spent Sundays with us, not because he wanted something, but because he cared. He has chosen a career in teaching, serving others rather than chasing status. For those reasons, we trust him to carry on our legacy, not just the money, but the values we build our lives upon." The screen went dark, and for a moment no one moved. I sat frozen, trying to process the enormity of it all. My grandparents had entrusted me with everything. Not my father, not my mother, not Eric me. That's when the shouting began. This is garbage. My father roared. They were senile when they wrote this. No court will uphold it. Linda's tone shifted to sickly sweet. David, honey, surely you don't believe this is right. You'll share with us, won't you? We're your family. We deserve our portion. Eric glared at me, his voice dripping with venom. Don't be selfish, man. You think you're better than us because you play school teacher. That money belongs to all of us. As they argued, my mind flashed back to Sunday afternoons in my grandparents' kitchen. Walter teaching me how to fix a leaky faucet. Margaret showing me how to make her apple pie from scratch. They had never cared about status symbols. They had cared about integrity. And now, in this moment, I understood why they had made the decision. They did. Samuel placed a heavy envelope in front of me. David, here are the documents, the keys to the farmhouse, and instructions for accessing the financial accounts. You don't need to make any decisions tonight. Take time, process this. But know this: your grandparents were of sound mind when they made this choice. They knew exactly what they were doing. I nodded numbly, clutching the envelope. Meanwhile, the voices of my parents and brothers swirled around me: threats, demands, guilt trips. And yet, through the noise, one truth settled deep in my heart. My grandparents had seen me for who I was. They had trusted me, and I would not betray that trust, no matter the cost. The shouting from that will reading didn't end in Samuel Brooks. Office it followed me home like a storm cloud. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment, my phone had already blown up with messages from my father, Charles, demanding I come to their house that evening. He didn't ask. He ordered. Out of habit more than obedience, I went. Their house was as cold and polished as ever, 5,000 square feet of glass and granite, designed to impress the neighbors but never to feel like a home. My mother, Linda, perched on the edge of a leather sofa, pearls gleaming against her black dress. My father stood by the fireplace, a tumbler of scotch in hand, while my brother, Eric, sprawled across the couch, still glued to his phone. Sit down, David, my father commanded, slipping into the same voice he used in boardrooms. Let's be reasonable about this. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. My mother jumped in. Sweetheart, you can't imagine how complicated managing wealth really is. Your father has the experience. He can take care of everything. You'll still get a nice portion, enough for a down payment on a real house instead of that shabby apartment. Her tone dripped with condescension, like she was patting me on the head for a job well done. I clenched my fists but stayed silent, hoping they would reveal their true intentions. And they did. My father leaned forward, eyes sharp. Here's the deal. You sign the estate over to me. I'll manage it. Ensure everyone gets their fair share. You'll receive 10%. More than generous for a teacher with limited needs. I couldn't help it. I laughed, though there was no humor in it. 10%, that's still millions of dollars. Exactly. Eric chimed in, finally looking up from his phone. More than enough for you. I need at least $5 million for my next business venture. This is how it's supposed to work, David. We all win. I stared at him in disbelief. His last venture had been some ridiculous app that raided public restrooms, which folded after burning through $50,000 of my parents' money. Yet here he was, demanding a bigger slice. Then my aunt, Pam, who had arrived late with her husband, Steve, piped up. The farmhouse should go to us. We've got 3 kids, and that neighborhood would give them access to better schools. I almost choked. Aunt Pam hadn't visited my grandparents in years. Her children were practically strangers to them. And yet, she was already redecorating their home in her head. As the night dragged on, their tactics shifted. When demands didn't work, they turned to guilt. After all we've done for you, my mother said, eyes glistening with what I suspected were well-rehearsed tears. This is how you repay us. We gave you life, opportunities, private schools, summer camps. We invested in you. And now you turn your back on us. Investment, that was the word she used. Not love, not care. Investment, as if I were some failed stock that had refused to pay dividends. Finally, my father's mask slipped. He slammed his glass down so hard it cracked against the table. Enough games, David. You either sign that paper tonight or you walk out of here. With nothing, you can't have both our family. And that money, shoes." His words echoed in the silence that followed. I looked at each of them, my mother's cold eyes, Eric's greedy smirk, Aunt Pam's false tears. And in that moment, the truth hit me like a hammer. I had never truly had a family, to them. I wasn't a son or a brother. I was a resource, a tool, a walking checkbook they hadn't yet cashed. I set the papers down and shook my head. "No, I won't sign. Grandma and Grandpa trusted me, and I'll honor that trust. If that means losing you, then so be it." The room erupted. My mother shrieked about ingratitude. Eric hurled insults. "I won't repeat." Aunt Pam sobbed about her children's future. Through it all, I sat still, the word no forming a shield around me. Finally, my father stepped forward, finger jabbing toward my chest. His voice was ice. "Then get out. Out of this house. Out of your apartment. You think you're independent. That lease you signed, we own that building through one of our companies. Consider it terminated. You've got 30 minutes to pack your things before the locks are changed." My stomach dropped. 30 minutes to gather my life. They weren't just cutting me out, they were trying to make me homeless. But even through the fear, one memory surfaced, my grandfather's voice when I was a boy, teaching me how to stand tall in a schoolyard fight. "No one can take your dignity unless you give it away, David. Know what's right and hold firm." So I stood, picked up my bag, and walked out the door. Behind me, the house echoed with the sound of a family I no longer recognized. Ahead of me was uncertainty, but for the first time in my life, I felt free. I drove through the night with my entire life stuffed into 3 duffel bags, my heart pounding with disbelief. My parents had actually kicked me out, their own son, because I wouldn't hand over what wasn't even theirs to begin with. For a moment I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had nowhere to go. Every place I thought of seemed closed to me. Then I remembered the envelope that Samuel Brooks, my grandparents' attorney, had given me. Inside were the keys to the farmhouse, the home where Walter and Margaret had raised me in spirit, if not in name. The drive out to the property took less than an hour, but it felt like traveling back in time. The porch light was still on, probably on a timer Grandpa had set years ago. My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock when the door swung open. The familiar scent of lemon wood polish and my grandmother's old potpourri wrapped around me like a blanket. For the first time that night, I felt like I wasn't completely lost. I carried my bags upstairs to the guest room I had always used. The bedspread was the same one Grandma had tucked in so neatly every Sunday, and the novel I'd been reading during my last visit still sat on the nightstand with a bookmark halfway through. It was as if they had been expecting me. I sank onto the bed, exhausted, and cried until I finally drifted to sleep. Morning light streamed through the curtains, and with it came the weight of reality. My phone buzzed, endlessly missed calls from my father, angry texts from Eric, a guilt-laden message from my mother. One of Eric's texts made my stomach twist. "Enjoy the farmhouse while you can. Tomorrow, it'll be ours." His words felt less like a threat and more like a promise. Before fear could take over, the doorbell rang. I froze. Through the window, I saw Samuel's car in the driveway. Relief flooded me. He walked in carrying a briefcase and 2 cups of coffee. "You did the right thing last night," he said, setting a cup on the kitchen table. "Your grandparents anticipated all of this." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Walter and Margaret knew your father would contest the will. They spent years documenting everything, every demand for money, every ugly confrontation, every instance of neglect, and they made sure you wouldn't face this battle alone." Just then, another knock sounded at the back door. Samuel smiled. Knowingly, "That will be Carlos Ramirez." I opened the door to find Carlos, my grandparents' caretaker and handyman of nearly 20 years. His salt and pepper hair and kind eyes brought me right back to summers spent tagging along. While he fixed fences or trimmed hedges, he removed his cap respectfully. "Mr. David, your grandparents worried this day might come. They asked me to look after you if it did." We sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Grandma had served pancakes every Sunday morning. Carlos leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your father and brother came here after the funeral. They took things: watches, jewelry, electronics. But what they didn't know is that Mr. Walter had me upgrade the security system last year. I have everything on camera. Samuel nodded. That footage will be powerful if they push this into court. Carlos then led me into Grandma's study, a room filled with bookshelves and neatly labeled boxes. He pulled down a row of leather-bound journals. Mrs. Margaret wrote everything down. He explained. Every visit, every phone call, every insult. She wanted there to be a record. I opened one at random and immediately recognized her. Handwriting. May 15th. Charles visited today after months of silence. He wanted money for another business venture. When we said no, he accused us of favoring David. He couldn't be more wrong. David has never asked us for a dime. He comes because he cares. Tears welled up in my eyes as I flipped through page after page. My grandparents had been preparing for years, not just protecting their money, but preserving their truth. By the afternoon, more of their trusted circle began to arrive. Dorothy Reynolds, their housekeeper of 2 decades, hugged me like a grandmother herself. Later, Rosa Martinez, their business partner, came with files on Alexander Trucking and assured me the company was solid and thriving. Each visitor carried not only support, but living proof of the lives Walter and Margaret had touched. That evening, as the farmhouse filled with the smell of Dorothy's cooking, I realized I wasn't alone. My blood relatives might have turned against me, but my grandparents had left me with something stronger than money: a community of people who loved them and, by extension, cared for me. As I looked around the table at Samuel, Carlos, Dorothy, and Rosa, I felt a calm determination rising in me. My grandparents had trusted me with their legacy, and I would honor that trust. The battle with my family was far from over, but I was no longer facing it alone. That night, after Dorothy's casserole had been cleared away and the house grew quiet, I sat alone at my grandparents' desk with their journals spread before me. Each one told a story not of wealth, but of years of patience, disappointment, and quiet strength. My grandmother's handwriting flowed neatly across every page, chronicling not only recipes and weather, but every visit from my parents, every outburst from my father, every hollow promise from Eric. One entry from last spring caught my eye. Charles came by today, asking for money for Eric's new tech company. When Walter said no, Charles accused us of being old and out of touch. He stormed out without finishing his coffee. I fear he sees us only as a wallet. David, on the other hand, brought soup for dinner last night and stayed to fix the leaky faucet. He never asks for anything. He is our true blessing. Reading those words, I finally understood my grandparents hadn't left their fortune to me out of sentiment. They had left it to me because they knew who I was and who my parents had chosen to become. As I closed the journal, Carlos appeared in the doorway with a USB drive in his hand. There's something you need to see, he said. He loaded the footage onto the living room TV, and my stomach dropped as I watched grainy video of my father and Eric rummaging through my grandparents' home just days after the funeral. They pocketed watches, jewelry, even Margaret's silver locket, the one she wore at every church service. They thought no one was watching. They didn't know Walter had me install new cameras last year. Carlos explained softly. He said he didn't trust the system your father set up. Too many blind spots. I felt anger rise in me, hot and steady. This wasn't just greed, it was theft. And my grandparents had prepared for even this. The next morning brought another wave of visitors. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' longtime business partner, arrived with thick binders of financial statements. She explained every corner of Alexander Trucking, assuring me the company was strong. Your grandparents wanted you to know the business was built on loyalty, she said, not shortcuts, not schemes. They believed you'd preserve that. Later, George Patel, their investment advisor, stopped by with portfolios outlining every stock, every bond, every charitable trust. Then Sarah Johnson, their neighbor of 30 years, walked in with a basket of homemade bread and tears in her eyes. Your grandparents loved you. David, she whispered, they were so proud. We all were, as the farmhouse filled with voices and memories. I realized my grandparents had done something extraordinary. They hadn't just left me money. They had left me a community of people who carried their values, people who had known the real Walter and Margaret, who loved them not for what they owned, but for who they were. Then Dorothy came into the study with a small envelope she had found hidden in a drawer. Inside were letters, decades of them, from my father to my grandparents. Each one was the same: demands for money, veiled threats, excuses. Some even hinted that if they didn't comply, they might lose access to David. My throat tightened as I realized how long they had tried to use me as leverage. Dorothy laid a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Your grandmother kept every one of these, David. She wanted you to know the truth." By late afternoon, Samuel gathered us all in the dining room. He looked around at the faces: Carlos, Rosa, George, Dorothy, Sarah, and then at me. "Your grandparents were meticulous," he said. "They knew Richard and Eric would come after you. That's why they documented everything, why they built this circle around you. They didn't just protect their estate, David. They protected you." I sat back, letting his words settle. For the first time in days, I felt something other than fear or anger. I felt resolve. My grandparents had seen this coming, and they had prepared me not only with money, but with allies, with truth, with the strength of their example. That evening, as I stood on the farmhouse porch watching the sun set over the fields, my phone buzzed again. A message from Eric lit up the screen. "Enjoy the house tonight. Tomorrow, we're coming to collect what belongs to us. Better not stand in our way." I read it twice, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Fear could have taken me over, but instead, I felt something different, a steady calm. Tomorrow would be the day everything came to a head, and for the first time, I believed I was ready. The farmhouse grew quieter as night settled in, but my mind refused to rest. I sat at my grandmother Margaret's desk, leather-bound journals stacked in front of me like soldiers ready for battle. Each one was dated, neatly labeled, and filled with her graceful handwriting. At first glance, they looked like ordinary diaries, recipes, weather notes, holiday memories. But as I turned the pages, I realized they were something far more powerful, a record of my family's true character. One entry stopped me cold. May 15th, Charles visited today after months of silence. He wanted $150,000 for Eric's latest venture. When Walter said no, Charles accused us of loving David more. He could not be more wrong. David has never asked us for a dime. He comes because he cares. Walter was so upset he could not finish his coffee. I had lived those moments, but reading them in her own words was like hearing her voice again. Page after page confirmed what I already knew deep down. My grandparents had seen my parents and brother for what they were long before I did. A knock at the back door startled me. It was nearly midnight. I hesitated, then opened it to find Carlos Ramirez, my grandparents' caretaker, holding a USB drive in his hand. His kind eyes were steady. "David, there's something you need to see," he said, on the living room television. Carlos pulled up footage from the upgraded security system my grandfather had secretly asked him to install. The images made my stomach turn. My father and Eric, days after the funeral, rifling through drawers, stuffing jewelry and watches into their pockets. Even my mother's face appeared on screen, slipping Margaret's pearl earrings into her handbag before the burial reception had even ended. "They thought no one would ever know," Carlos said quietly. "But Walter never trusted the system your father installed years ago. Too many blind spots. So he had me put in new cameras. Everything is recorded." I leaned back in the chair, sickened but also strangely relieved. Finally, proof of what my grandparents had endured and why they had chosen me. The next morning brought more visitors. Dorothy Reynolds, who had been their housekeeper for 2 decades, arrived with a basket of muffins and tears in her eyes. She hugged me tightly. "You look just like your grandmother when she was young," she whispered. Then she handed me an envelope she'd found while cleaning the study, a stack of letters from my father spanning back 30 years. Each one demanded money, some laced with veiled threats. "If you can't help us, maybe we shouldn't bring David around so much." My throat tightened as I read. My grandparents had saved them all, maybe knowing one day I'd need the truth in black and white. By noon, The farmhouse kitchen buzzed with voices. Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' longtime business partner, laid out binders filled with company records. Alexander Trucking is strong, she assured me. Your grandparents wanted you to know this business was built on loyalty. They trusted you to keep it that way. Then came George Patel, their investment advisor, who carried portfolios showing how every dollar had been structured. They wanted you to have security, David, he said. But more than that, they wanted you to have clarity. Finally, Sarah Johnson, their neighbor of 30 years, arrived with a casserole dish still warm from her oven. She sat at the table and told stories of backyard picnics, of Walter fixing her lawnmower, of Margaret baking pies for every church fundraiser. Listening to her, I realized my grandparents had lived lives of quiet generosity that stretched far beyond our family. As the afternoon wore on, I looked around the farmhouse, the journals spread across the table, the letters piled neatly, the USB drive plugged into Samuel's laptop, the friends and neighbors who had loved Walter and Margaret as their own. My parents thought they could isolate me, bully me into surrender. But here, in this house, my grandparents had left me something stronger than money, a network of truth, loyalty, and living witnesses to their character. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel spoke with quiet certainty. David, your grandparents anticipated this. They built a wall of evidence around you, and they built a circle of people who will not let you stand alone. Your father and brother may come tomorrow, but you will not face them by yourself. I walked out onto the porch as the sky turned pink and gold, the cool air sharpened my lungs. For the first time since the funeral, I felt steady. My family might rive with threats and demands, but I had something they could never take: my grandparents' faith, their careful planning, and a community bound not by blood, but by trust. The night before the confrontation, I barely slept. I kept hearing Eric's last message echoing in my head. Tomorrow at 10. We're coming to collect what belongs to us. Better not try to stop us. Every word dripped with threat. But when dawn broke, I felt something different, not fear, but resolve. By 8 o'clock, Samuel Brooks pulled into the farmhouse driveway, his briefcase in one hand, a tray of coffee in the other. Eat something, he urged. You'll need your strength. He opened his case and laid out folders. Across the dining table, restraining orders, cease and desist letters, notarized statements. Your grandparents didn't just leave you wealth, David. They left you protection. Soon after, Dorothy arrived carrying a bag of groceries. She moved about the kitchen like she always had, frying bacon, brewing fresh coffee, her calm presence reminding me of Sunday mornings long ago. Then came Carlos, standing tall at the front door, promising to handle anyone who tried to force their way in. Rosa Martinez set up her laptop at the dining table, ready to present company records. Even George Patel stopped by, prepared with financial documents that could silence any doubts about the legitimacy of the will. By 9:30, the farmhouse felt less like a vulnerable home and more like a fortress filled not with guards, but with loyal friends who had loved Walter and Margaret. I looked around and realized I wasn't alone. I had a family here, just not the one I'd been born into. At exactly 9:45, the sound of engines broke the quiet. A sleek black sedan, a white SUV, and Eric's flashy sports car rolled up the gravel drive, followed by Aunt Pam's red convertible. My father was first out, his face set in the cold mask of a man used to getting his way. My mother followed, her heels clicking sharply on the porch steps, eyes darting toward the windows. Eric leaned against his car with a smug grin, while Aunt Pam huffed as if the whole visit were an inconvenience. The pounding on the front door shook the frame. David, my father bellowed, "Open up. This is family business." Carlos opened the door instead, standing tall in the entryway. "Miss Natalie, Mr. David is expecting you. Come in." They pushed past him, their voices already raised, but then they froze. Inside the living room sat Samuel, Rosa, George, Dorothy, and several longtime employees of Alexander Trucking who had quietly arrived earlier. It wasn't just me waiting for them, it was an entire circle of my grandparents' legacy. "What is this?" my mother hissed. "Why are outsiders here?" Before I could speak, the front door opened again. In walked Judge Robert Henderson, a longtime friend of my grandparents, followed by Police Chief Maria Williams, whose daughter had received a scholarship from my grandparents' foundation. My father's face paled at the sight of the judge. "Robert," he said, forcing a smile, "what brings you here?" The judge's voice was steady, commanding. "I'm here because Walter and Margaret asked me to be. They knew disputes might arise after their passing, and they wanted a neutral witness to protect their wishes." The tension was electric. My parents glanced nervously at each other, but Eric broke the silence with a sneer. "This is a joke. We're here for what's rightfully ours." I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "No, Eric, you're here to take what doesn't belong to you. Grandma and Grandpa made their decision, and I intend to honor it." My father jabbed a finger at me. "They were manipulated. You don't deserve a cent of this. Sign it over, or we'll drag this into court." Samuel rose, his calm presence filling the room. "You can try, but we have documentation of every attempt you've made to bleed your parents dry. We have journals, letters, security footage. Contesting this will only drag your behavior into the light of day." One by one, Rosa, George, and Carlos presented evidence in paid loans, forged checks, even footage of jewelry pocketed after the funeral. My family's faces grew darker with every revelation. Aunt Pam sputtered accusations, but the judge silenced her with a single glance. At last, I held up the documents Samuel had prepared. "These are cease and desist letters. If you threaten me again, if you step foot on this property without permission, the law will handle it. My grandparents trusted me for a reason. I won't let you erase that." The room went still for the first time. I saw doubt flicker in my father's eyes. He looked at the judge, at the chief of police, at the growing wall of evidence, and knew the fight was over. He muttered, "This isn't finished." But the defeat in his voice betrayed him. As they filed out, Eric shot me a glare. "You think you've won? This isn't the end." I didn't flinch. "No, Eric," I said quietly. "It's the end of you using our family like a bank." When their cars finally disappeared down the road, the farmhouse felt lighter, as if Walter and Margaret themselves had been standing there beside me. Around me, their friends smiled, offering reassurance. Judge Henderson placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Your grandparents would be proud, David. Not because you won, but because you stood your ground with dignity." And for the first time, in a long time, I believed it. When the last of their cars disappeared down the long gravel drive, silence settled over the farmhouse. For a moment, I just stood there in the entryway, the documents still clutched in my hands. The house that had moments ago been filled with shouting, accusations, and threats was suddenly eerily quiet. I should have felt victorious. After all, I had stood my ground. I had honored Walter and Margaret's wishes and refused to bend under the weight of pressure. But instead of triumph, what I felt was emptiness. These people, the ones who had just stormed out, were my blood. My father, my mother, my brother, my aunt. And yet, staring at that closed front door, I realized how little those titles really meant. It was a hollow victory. Sensing my unease, Dorothy bustled back into the living room, carrying a tray of fresh coffee and pastries. "Now," she said gently, "let's get some warmth back in this house." She poured a cup and slid it toward me. The simple gesture reminded me of all the Sundays my grandmother had done the very same thing at this very table. Soon the others gathered as well. Samuel stacked the papers neatly. Rosa closed her laptop. Carlos pulled the curtains back to let the afternoon sun spill in. What just hours before had felt like a courtroom now looked once again like a home. Judge Henderson remained behind for a while. He rested a steady hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "David, your grandparents would be proud, not just because you protected their estate, but because you did it with dignity. You didn't scream, you didn't sink to their level, you stood firm, and that's what matters." I nodded, though a lump rose in my throat. The truth was hard to admit even to myself. I hadn't just lost a legal battle with my family that morning, I had lost my family itself. But as the hours passed, something shifted. Rosa told me stories about the early years of Alexander Trucking, how Walter had started with one rusty pickup and a dream, how Margaret had kept the books by hand at their kitchen table, George explained how carefully my grandparents had invested, not to flaunt wealth but to create stability for their employees. Sarah, the neighbor, laughed as she recalled neighborhood barbecues and church picnics, where my grandparents had quietly paid for food so others wouldn't have to. Listening to them, I realized the truth. Walter and Margaret had been building something far greater than a business or a bank account. They had been building a community, and that community was now sitting in my living room, surrounding me with the kind of loyalty and affection my blood relatives had never shown. That evening, Dorothy set the dining table just as my grandmother used to, right down to the mismatched silverware. We shared a meal not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. There was laughter, there were tears, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a little lighter. After everyone had left, I walked upstairs and paused in the doorway of my grandparents' bedroom. I hadn't been able to step inside since they passed, but tonight, something pulled me forward. The room smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender sachets. Walter's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, and for the first time, the house didn't feel empty. It felt alive again. I whispered into the quiet, "I hope I made you proud today." There was no answer, but I didn't need one. I could feel it, the steadiness, the calm, the quiet pride they had always carried. It was as if they were still here, reminding me that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, by loyalty, and by the values you choose to carry forward. I went to bed that night still carrying a hollow ache, but beneath it, something new was growing, a sense of belonging, not to the family I was born into, but to the one my grandparents had built with their own two hands. And that realization was worth more than any fortune. A week after the confrontation at the farmhouse, a thick envelope arrived by courier. The return address read Brooks and Associates Law Offices. My heart raced as I broke the seal. Inside were certified legal documents, stamped and signed, confirming what Samuel had promised. I was now the sole, uncontested heir to Walter and Margaret Miller's estate. The farmhouse, the business shares, the investments, every part of their life's work now rested in my hands, beyond challenge. For the first time, the fog of uncertainty began to lift. Yet with clarity came another weight, responsibility. My grandparents hadn't raised me to hoard wealth or let it make me arrogant. They raised me to be deliberate, thoughtful, and fair. I knew what I had to do next. That afternoon, I spread boxes across the farmhouse living room and began sorting through decades of belongings. Some items made me laugh out loud. The old tin coffee can Grandpa used to store loose screws, the faded apron Grandma wore every Thanksgiving. Other things stopped me in my tracks, like photo albums filled with birthdays my parents never bothered to attend. I created 3 piles, just as Grandpa once taught me: go, stay, travel. Go, items that belonged to my father, mother, Eric, or Aunt Pam, things they had left behind at family gatherings, mementos that weren't part of my story. Stay, heirlooms that carried the weight of family history: Grandma's quilt, Grandpa's fishing rods, their wedding china. Travel, the essentials I would carry with me if I had to leave quickly: documents, photographs, and a few personal treasures. It was a cleansing ritual, one that gave me back a sense of control my family had tried to steal. By evening, I had filled several boxes marked with each of their names. With Samuel's help, I arranged for them to be delivered by courier. Inside each box, I placed a short note, written in my own hand: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. I knew the gesture would sting, but it was the truth. They had tried to strip me of my inheritance, but I refused to let them accuse me of holding onto anything that wasn't mine. When the boxes were picked up the next morning, I felt lighter. This farmhouse, these fields, the journals and documents, they were my grandparents' legacy. Everything else could go back where it came from. That afternoon, as I walked the property, I thought about how far my father had strayed from his parents' example. He had seen money as entitlement, while they had seen it as a tool. He had seen status, while they had seen service. And Eric had never seen further than his next scheme. I paused near the vegetable garden where Grandpa once showed me how to stake tomato plants. I could almost hear his voice: keep the vines supported, David. Otherwise, they'll collapse under their own weight. In that moment, I realized the same was true for me. This inheritance could either crush me or, with the right supports, it could grow into something strong. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Got your little delivery. Cute. But don't think this means you've won. Family doesn't work that way." For once, I didn't reply. Instead, I folded Grandma's quilt across the foot of my bed and opened another journal. I had no desire to fight their battles anymore. My job wasn't to win their approval, it was to honor Walter and Margaret by living the values they had taught me. I closed my eyes that night with a strange sense of peace. My family could rage all they wanted, but I had drawn my line. I had returned what was theirs, and I would keep what was mine. No more manipulation, no more control. For the first time in years, I felt free. And freedom, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. It didn't take long for the response to come. 2 days after the boxes were delivered back to my parents' home, my father showed up at the farmhouse unannounced. He didn't knock. He barged in as though the place still belonged to him. Behind him trailed Eric, scowling, arms folded across his chest. "Cute stunt with the boxes." My father sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you're not finished with us." Not by a long shot. I set down the mug of coffee I was holding and turned slowly to face them. "Dad, this is my home now. If you can't respect that, you need to leave." Eric stepped forward, his voice rising. "You think you're better than us? Sitting here like some saint with Grandpa's money. You'll burn through it in a year, and then you'll come crawling back. Mark my words." I looked at him, my younger brother who had never held down a job longer than a season, who had squandered every chance given to him, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not pity, but clarity. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "I don't measure worth in dollars. Grandma and Grandpa didn't either. That's why they left this to me. They trusted I would use it wisely, not waste it chasing shortcuts." My father's face hardened. He jabbed a finger in my chest, his old intimidation tactic. "You have one last chance, David. Sign the estate over, or you're no longer part of this family. You can't have both." For a moment, the ultimatum hung heavy in the air. The same words he had used weeks earlier. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt strength. I straightened my shoulders and met his gaze. "You're right about one thing, Dad. I can't have both. But I've made my choice. My family isn't the people trying to control me. My family is the people who actually care, the ones Grandma and Grandpa surrounded themselves with, the ones who showed up for me when you tried to throw me out." The room went silent. Eric muttered something under his breath, but my father didn't move. He just stared, his authority crumbling in the face of a son he could no longer bully. After a long moment, he turned toward the door. "Don't come crying to us when it all falls apart," he growled. I watched them leave, their car disappearing down the long driveway. A chapter had closed. That evening, I walked through the farmhouse, touching the familiar banister, the worn kitchen counters, the quilt folded neatly at the end of my bed. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I was standing on my own. As I sat by the fireplace, a wave of calm washed over me. My grandparents had given me more than money. They had given me freedom. Freedom to live by my own values, not by the demands of people who had never truly loved me. Sometimes, the people tied to us by blood can be the very ones who try to clip our wings. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is to set boundaries, to say no when manipulation and control threaten our dignity. Walter and Margaret Miller left me a fortune. Yes, but the real inheritance was their wisdom. Money is just a tool, but integrity is everything. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand your ground against pressure from family or friends? Share your experiences in the comments. I read every one of them, and if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, betrayal, and the quiet power of doing what's right, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because family isn't just about blood, it's about love, respect, and the courage to live by your values.